we weren't going to hang out and chit-chat or whatever. She knew that the clock was the enemy. We have to move forward.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at the Rust costume designer, Therese Magpale Davis. She worked in the wardrobe department of the movie Rust, and her remarks about the ugly false noise from just one or two people in terms of this whole thing that has happened. She put these posts on Instagram. They were then shared by Alec Baldwin. All of this played out a couple of weeks ago now. Stay tuned to the end of this episode. I'm going to be talking about a live that I'll be doing tonight. Well, Christmas Eve my time. It'll be probably closer to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, your time. So stay tuned for that. But before we get started with this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I'm going to jump right in and read through Therese Magpale Davis's posts. I think they're kind of like 6 pages worth, but it is quite a long section. And as I say, these were shared onto Alec Baldwin's Instagram, I think around about the 3rd of November, and that obviously means that he seconds or supports basically what she's saying. Anyway, these are her words. I'm so sick of this narrative. I worked on this movie. The story being spun of us being overworked and surrounded by unsafe, chaotic conditions is bull something. We never worked more than a 12.5 hour shoot day. That was once. Most days were under 12. The day Helena died, we had come off of a 12-hour turnaround after an 11-hour shoot day. We had, including camera, gotten off by 6:30 p.m. We had just had a 56-hour weekend right before that. No one was too tired to do their jobs. This is all provable by daily timesheets. The camera crew had hotels. They just didn't feel like they were fancy enough. Not that they were unsafe. You can't tell me that 6 big men felt so unsafe in their hotel, but were fine sleeping in their cars, in parking lots, which never happened, like they also claimed. They were given hotels. Half of them didn't use them even when the hotels were nicer, because we were getting off so early each night. And our set was only 35 minutes from Albuquerque. Santa Fe is an hour from Albuquerque, but the set was 25 minutes south of that. So they aren't even traveling that far to go home. So if you go and Google the distance, Google Maps the distance between Bonanza Creek Ranch and Santa Fe, just based on Google, the distance is less than 20 miles. And about half an hour's drive. That's via the I-25 north, right? Half an hour. If you go from Bonanza Creek Ranch in the opposite direction to Albuquerque, then it is twice as far, 54 minutes, and more than twice as far in terms of distance, 51 miles, right? And bear in mind, it's not just one way, it's both ways. So you're driving an hour to get back to your hotel, right, at the end of a shoot, and then the next morning an hour to return to the set, right? So it's 2 hours commuting per day, which is quite long, quite far, and possibly quite expensive. The other thing that I think one's got to bear in mind is shooting tends to start quite early on a film set. I think it started 6:30 p.m. on the 21st of October, which means they would have had to leave at least 5:30 a.m. and did I say p.m. earlier? 5:30 a.m. and that means they've got to eat breakfast, if they're going to eat breakfast, even earlier. And so you are kind of arriving at your hotel, and then you've immediately kind of got to prepare for work the next day. And although she's saying that there's not really a big difference between the two, it does seem that there was a big difference. Now, you might say, if I've worked as a photojournalist, and I've worked on extremely difficult, time-consuming scenarios, and maybe I wouldn't complain, but something like when you're on a movie and there are 90 crew, and there are all sorts of protocols, and you're shooting to a schedule, and I think, speaking as a photographer, the camera crew possibly work harder than the other crew, and you might shoot me for saying that, but the camera crew have got to be totally on point. They are recording everything, and the buck kind of stops with them. So they've got to make sure everything is right. They've got to be concentrating. It's quite difficult to concentrate for that length of time. I've gone on shoots and they go on for hours, and it's physically exhausting. But for me, the tougher part is the mental side, the staring into monitors, the editing of the photos, but that whole visual thing that you're trying to get 100% takes a lot out of you. It's almost like writing a maths exam. So I think the stress on a camera crew is more than on a costume designer. I don't know if the costume designer, I don't know, it's just my opinion. I think the resources in terms of focus and concentration for the camera crew are kind of constant, right? Getting the lighting just right, all that kind of thing. Then she goes on to say they try to renegotiate their contracts halfway through the show and hold the producers over a barrel by walking out. They literally said they deserved more money and nicer hotels than the rest of the crew because they were better than the rest of the crew. These guys are not heroes. They only cared about themselves. Again, provable. These producers who supposedly don't care about their crew have worked tirelessly alongside us. They were some of the most approachable and warm producers I've ever worked with. Now, there's a little bit of a difference of opinion there where I'm not sure if we're talking about producers, but, if you take the assistant director, there's talk about people yelling at one another. So, I think you could say the producers were certain kind of people, maybe very laid back or something. But there certainly wasn't a warm and fuzzy vibe amongst everyone. And you kind of are getting a prickly response from this particular crew member as well regarding others. And that's the point, is that the crew weren't really getting along very well. They weren't seeing eye to eye. And I think part of that is because of they didn't have time to gel. They didn't perhaps know one another. She calls them camera jerks. She says, concerns were heard and addressed. Even these camera jerks were being heard, and they were given what they asked for many times until it became too much. Some of these producers waived their entire fees to make sure we could make this movie and pay for things like hotels for everyone who asked. Now, again, bear in mind, Alec Baldwin has endorsed this message by putting it on his own Instagram. So when she says some of these producers waived their entire fees to make sure we could make this movie and pay for things like hotels, it sounds like that he agrees with that. And then she says, and before you say that's because they had back-end deals, no. Several of them did not. They worked longer hours than the crew, and they did it for free. And then there's quite a long section about the union, which is a little bit difficult to figure out. I don't know how relevant it is here, but I'll read it anyway. We had a union rep. He finally told production not to give in to the camera crew because they were demanding things the union does not require, and they were trying to renegotiate a contract halfway through shooting. It's called negotiating in bad faith. The production was given permission to hire off the union overflow list for some of the camera crew the next day. It's sort of gobbledygook. I mean, all of this technical stuff isn't really, I think, that relevant to the basic true crime scenario. Anyway, she goes on to say, I can't understand why Atlanta people are joining the whole they hired non-union horror and shock expression. We literally only have to pay our money to join the union. So I think there was some bad feeling about the union crew being replaced by non-union crew kind of thing. And I think what that involves is this whole idea of if the 6 union members walked off, you sort of almost imagine kind of solidarity with the rest of the union, and that would sort of hold the entire production hostage until things were sorted out. But in the end, they did something surprising and outsourced 6 individuals, which perhaps no one expected. Anyway, she goes on to say, in New Mexico, they have an overflow list they join when they apply to the union. They have to get a certain amount of days worked on a union show before they're eligible to join. I'm not sure if I'm going to read the rest of this stuff about the union. It doesn't really go on that much further. She says every non-union person hired on the show was from that list, and we had union approval to hire them. Then she talks about the armorer. This is obviously a reference to Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. The armorer had apprenticed to a well-known armorer, and I'm not really sure what she's talking about there. I don't know whether she means to her father or whether she means to Seth Kenny, that he was kind of her mentor. I'm not quite sure what she's referring to there, but she doesn't mention any names. She says the armorer had apprenticed to a well-known armorer and had been in the same position on the same type of movie a few months before. That's true, but she doesn't mention anything going wrong on that same type of movie. Was she the most experienced person? No. So there's an acknowledgement. Were her qualifications typical for a tier 1? Yes. You can say what you want about even lower tiers needing qualified people, and I will agree, another concession. But how do you suppose anyone will get that experience? We all had a first and second job at one point or another. How do you suggest producers and UPMA sort out the people worth giving that shot to from the people who just look good on their resume and have great references? Because Hannah had both. I think there's a bit of a difference here where you say you should give an inexperienced person a chance when we're talking about something like safety and look at what ultimately happened. I think there should be more apprenticeships and a bigger focus certainly on experience in order to make sure safety can be met. I really don't think you can make the argument that just give someone a chance to get experience when it's something as critically important as dealing with the firearms, right? So I don't know if you can make that argument. Sure, on other areas such as, give someone a chance to get experience where there's not so much riding on if there's a mistake. The other thing is when you start having misfires, I really don't think you can say, oh, it's this person's just getting some experience, right? And then she talks about misfires. She says, the misfires were accidental discharges, which are more common than you think. Yes, there's a difference. And the guns were checked immediately afterwards. So she actually seems to be kind of normalizing this. Helena was shot and she died. And yeah, the costume designer is kind of normalizing, oh yeah, we had accidental discharges. They're quite common. It's no big deal. I don't know how you can say that and then someone did actually die. It's serious. It's serious that there were the accidental discharges before. And as I've said many times, you can't have one accidental discharge after another and then keep calling them accidental. There's some point where there is a sense of resignation to what's going on that's not appropriate. And then she says the guns were checked immediately afterwards and the discharges were announced on set and apologized for. I was right there. So that's quite a good concession there because she can now be asked to talk about what she witnessed, what she saw, what was said. I heard that there were only something like 3 safety briefings. And I don't know if it's fair to have a safety briefing whenever there's an accidental discharge. There should be something like that perhaps every day on a set like that. And I also don't know whether the appropriate thing was to check the guns. I think they should have checked the rounds. They should have checked the ammunition. Can you imagine after the first accidental discharge if they'd simply checked all of the ammunition properly, once and for all? They could have prevented all the other accidental discharges, and ultimately what happened. Then she says, we had several safety meetings, sometimes multiple per day. So this is a contradiction to what we've heard elsewhere, that there weren't many safety meetings. Then she refers to Dave Halls. Our assistant director never seemed flippant about safety. He may have in other shows, but he wasn't like that on ours. That's quite an interesting point she's making there, is that she says, she uses the word flippant, that he wasn't flippant. So she seems to acknowledge that he had a reputation of not being completely safe in other films, but she's insisting that he wasn't like that on ours. And yet he actually said that he didn't check the gun properly when he handed it over to Alec Baldwin. Remember, he was the one who said cold gun. And then she says, obviously he screwed up majorly that day. And so this in itself is quite contradictory, where she's saying he wasn't flippant about safety. Oh, he just screwed up majorly that day. And then she says something very interesting. He was stressed, meaning Dave Halls was stressed because the camera walkout had, I think she means on us. That part's a little bit garbled, but I think what she's getting at is that Dave Halls was right to be a bit distracted because he was stressed. And that's the point I've kind of been making all along, is that they were stressed. I know I made a video about that not too many people watched, where you're basically seeing that for all sorts of reasons, the stresses and strains on that day and perhaps on the entire production were a bit unusual, and that we know that he was stressed because apparently the script supervisor said that he was yelling at her during the lunch break. So the fact that he was stressed means that he was possibly compromised in some way, possibly not able to pay the full amount of attention to safety that he should have done. But the other question is, what about the stress for everybody else? Was Hannah stressed? Was someone shouting at Hannah? Was somebody else stressed? Was Sarah Zachary stressed? And why were these stresses taking place? In terms of the culture, what was the cultural approach in terms of the entire crew to one another, to what was happening? And one thing I've noticed with some of the crew members, from the things that I've seen, there's quite a lot of swearing and indignation and feeling, quite a lot of expressive expletives being used, which seems to show there was a lot of feeling, there was a lot of emotion and anger on the set. Doesn't it feel that way? And then she says something about being worked too hard, that some people may have thought that they were being worked too hard. She says, I know what that feels like. This wasn't that. This was about gun safety, something we could all stand to learn a little more from about, so that we know if we're seeing something a bit off. I know that's not as much fun to jump on as vilifying producers. Personal responsibility is the last thing anyone wants to focus on in a tragedy. But if I look at what I could do differently, I'd learn more of the protocols and call them out if I saw they weren't followed. I'd ask to see the gun cleared if it was about to be handed to an actor and had seen the proper procedure followed. I'd call out an AD who was handing a gun to an actor, not because that's my job, but because I never want to lose someone I love to this again. I'd fight for better gun safety on set in Elena's name. I'd fight to never have a live gun on set again in her name. I'll fight to have our armorers have higher standards they must pass to be in that position where they hold all of our lives in their hands. But I'm not okay with using her to be the poster child for better hours. We had exactly the kind of hours we all say we want. Maybe before you send those letters telling the Thomasville producers what you think of them for hiring non-union, you might want to wait and find out what the majority of those of us who worked with them actually feel about them. And so she's talking about the majority, but obviously there was a minority that weren't happy. And there was apparently someone who was so tired that he slept in his car. That is something that apparently came up. Remember that the ones who run to the press first aren't always the most reliable. Most of us are grieving very deeply and want nothing to do with the press. Not to mention we are trying to cooperate with an investigation. Maybe you could remember what it's like to work on a tightly knit indie set and realize that these producers are just as wrecked over this as the crew is. I must say, and perhaps I'm biased because I'm arguably a member of the media, but you might say you don't run to the press and the press is terrible, but then you respond on social media with swear words and a sort of a casual approach. So the thing with the media is you might not think so, but when you're interviewed, someone will follow up. There'll be follow-up questions, and there might also be questions to check what you're saying and to address issues that come across in a certain way. And when you put a statement up like this on social media, there's no right of reply. You make your statement and that's it. And whereas with the media, there's a little bit of interpretation of what he said. And so the interesting thing is quite a few crew members, not only on this set, but on other sets, have said similar things. And so are they also, is there also something wrong with them? Are they also unreliable? And I think it's quite an interesting accusation here that this idea of those people are unreliable. Well, then what actually happened in this particular situation? Something somewhere wasn't reliable, wasn't trustworthy, wasn't right, and that led to Helena being shot. But the people who were worrying about safety, they're the ones that were unreliable. Just seems to me a little bit strange, perhaps.
A little hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
So when she writes, most of us are grieving very deeply and want nothing to do with the press, well, this post of hers appeared all over the press. It was, as I say, reinforced by Alec Baldwin, and so it did have an impact on the story. She also says, not to mention we are trying to cooperate with an investigation. Now, if you take that and you look at certain people in the investigation that haven't been cooperative, it's quite interesting. Just think about that. Who would you say haven't really been that cooperative with the investigation? It's quite interesting. Then she goes on to say, maybe you could remember what it's like to work on a tightly knit indie set and realize that those producers are just as wrecked over this as the crew is. Maybe you could just not be one more person with a pitchfork in a mob that has no idea what you're talking about because, in all caps, you weren't there, right? Now, I must say, in true crime, I've heard that a lot. I've heard people say, because you weren't there, you'd know absolutely nothing. And so, you stay out of it and whatever. But the police weren't there. If a jury that's got to decide weren't there either. But something like the last photo takes you there. Something like someone who was there telling you what it was like takes you there. All of the different people giving their different version of events starts to crystallize what it was really like. And I don't know whether you can ever say, well, because you weren't there, you know nothing, and you can't ever know anything, so stay out of it. Because you weren't there, you need to find out, if you do want to find out. And so you ask the people who were there. And what she seems to be saying is, butt out. And I do think everything that she says has got to be seen in the context of what Lane Lupus said about, that he's literally on the show in New Mexico, and he says that the local crew are being treated in a really bad way, right? And he's talking, this is in real time, and he said, at the moment I'm fighting to get my crew on this movie hotel rooms when we go long or are too tired to drive the hour back from location to Albuquerque. So that tends to reinforce what Google Maps says, that it is an hour. And then he says they either say no or offer a garbage roadside motel that's used as a homeless shelter. In fact, the line producer on the flick complained the motel she booked charges her $10 more per night than the homeless. They haven't even paid the crew a proper check. Now, I do think if you're staying in a garbage motel, the way he puts it, you're not going to get rest. You're not going to be fresh the next day, and that certainly is is something to be concerned about. You know, you do need at the end of the day at least to get proper rest. And then he refers by name to a guy called Tyler who had to sleep in his car Sunday night because they wouldn't give him a room and he was too tired to drive the hour home. So there's someone mentioned, so is it true or isn't it true that he had to sleep in his car? For me, I don't really think it's more a case of who is right, who is wrong, who's telling the truth, who isn't. It's the fact that the crew aren't getting along. And because there's bickering going on, it's not a well-oiled machine. You might remember Alec Baldwin saying that we were a well-oiled machine. You might say, well, if there were just 6 crew members of the 90 that weren't, well, Helena was actually friends with the camera crew. She was a camera operator. She was the cinematographer. And so it's not just the 6 members that are fired that's going to affect morale, that's going to affect focus. It is the people that are friends with them working with them as well. So I think what you have here is people with different standards working together, people also with different levels of experience working together. But overall, you have a situation that's almost like a mixed family. You have people who don't know one another, and they suddenly, at very close quarters, expected to work together, and they're not. And this then causes stress, but they're also trying to stay to a schedule. And then the question is, did this compromise safety? And if the answer is yes, the next question is, well, whose fault is that? Who's responsible for this? And I do think it comes back to this whole idea, if you've had these discharges taking place, what measures did you take to prevent it from repeating? And in this particular series of messages from Therese, she seems to make it very, normalize it. She sort of says, we had several safety meetings. She said, the misfires are more common than you think. And she says the guns were checked immediately afterwards. She really speaks very little about that aspect and a lot more about the union stuff and other things. But the critical thing is, what was done when there was this accidental discharge? Who was it reported to? And what was the result of that? And the answer is obviously not enough, because ultimately somebody died at the end of that whole narrative. And that is how Therese Magpale Davis starts this. I'm so sick of this narrative. And the impression I get is she's more upset about what is being said about them, about the overworked, chaotic conditions, than of what actually happened to Elena. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be doing a live stream tonight, my time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, your time, on the John Benet Ramsey case. We're going to go into a fresh area that hasn't been explored before. So if you're interested in that, look out for that. And then I'm also going to be doing another live stream on Sunday, that's the 26th, the day after Christmas, on the 3 questions posed in the ABC documentary, The Deadly Take. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.